Welcome back to Heavier Than Heaven. Charles R. Cross. Big Jew, Big Boss. We're up to chapter 6. Didn't love him enough. It's the last one I'm going to read today. Aberdeen, Washington. September 1986, March through 1987. I obviously didn't love him enough, as I do now. 1987 journal entry. On September 1st, 1986, Wendy loaned Kurt $200, enough for her to deposit in the first month's rent. Kurt moved into his own first house. The legal description of his structure was 1000 East Street, 2nd in Aberdeen, was far too generous. It was a shack that, as many other municipalities, might have been condemned as an uninhabitable under reasonable building code. The roof was rotting, the boards on the front porch had fallen to the ground, and there wasn't a refrigerator or a stove. The floor plan was bizarrely broken into 5 tiny rooms, 2 living rooms, 2 bedrooms, and a single bathroom. It sat behind another house, which was the reason for the strange address. Still, the location 2 blocks from his mother's house was ideal for the 19-year-old who wasn't completely free of Wendy's psychic control. The relationship was improved in the past year, and with Kurt out of the house, they drew closer emotionally. He still very much needed Wendy's approval and attention, and even when hiding in a vulnerability, she would occasionally bring him food, and he could go to her house to do laundry or use the phone or raid the refrigerator. All of this provided his stepfather wasn't around. The shack was near the Salvation Army and behind the grocery store, and since the house didn't have a refrigerator, Kurt stored beer in an icebox on the back porch until the neighbor kids discovered this. For a roommate, Kurt chose Matt Lukin from the Melvins. Kurt had always wanted to be in the Melvins. Living with Lukin was as close as he got. Kurt's main combustion to the house was sticking a bathtub full of turtles in the middle of the living room and drilling a hole in the floor so the turtles' effluents would run under the floorboards. Luke, at least, used his construction skills to try and rearrange the walls as an added bonus. Lukin was 21, so he could buy the beer. The fat man would soon become a distant memory. It was both a party house and eventually a band house. With Lukin as a roommate, Buzz Osborne and Dale Crover visited frequently, and since the living room was filled with band gear, there was an impromptu jams. A motley crew of Melvin's Klingons came to inhabit the shack. Though much of the bonding was centered around the goal of the inebriation, the Halcyon time in the 1000 East, second to the most social of Kurt's life. Kurt even became friendly with the neighbors, or at least their teenage kids, who were victims of fatal alcohol syndrome. That didn't stop him from giving them beer. Another neighbor, a senile senior citizen nicknamed Leonard Skinner Hippie, would visit every day to listen to Kurt's copy of Leonard Skinner's greatest hits as he drummed along. To pay the rent, Kurt got a job to maintenance man as a Polynesian condominium resort in the early ocean shores. He would take the bus for a 25-mile trip to the coast resort. It was an easy job, and since his main responsibility was to repair things, the 66-room resort wasn't in the need of repair. And when the job mate came up, he recommended that Chris' girlfriend, Shelley, he used to sleep on the bus. She remembered it was funny because he was really a maintenance man at all. He'd sleep in the motel rooms or go and raid the refrigerators in the rooms after people left. One benefit of the job, other than $4 an hour in starting pay, was the only thing to wear a brown work shirt and not a dreaded uniform. He bragged about how easy the job was, and his friends describing it as a maintenance butt boy, and how he was able to pass most of his. Days, sneaking into the rooms and watching television, but why didn't he tell anyone that he had and occasionally cleaned rooms? Kurt Cobain, who had been a housekeeper, had to make some kind of a hall of fame. He had to work as a maid on a bus resort each morning and usually hung over. Kurt would dream of the future, as it did not include scrubbing toilets and making beds. What he did think at the time was the idea of forming a band, and it was a consistent refrain in his head. what he did think of all the time and the idea of forming a band. It was a constant refrain in his head. He spent endless hours trying to figure out how it could be done, and Buzz had it done. And if Buzz had it figured out, he was sure he could do it too. On a dozen occasions during the 1987, he'd travel out with the roadie of the Melvins to gigs in Olympia, a college town an hour east, where he'd observed an enthusiastic audience for punk rock, albeit to a small one. Once he'd made it all the way to Seattle with the band. And though that meant that he'd have to schlep the equipment and going to work with no sleep the next morning, it was the taste of a larger world. Being a Melvins roadie was not a glamorous job. There was the larger world. And there was no money or groupies to speak of, and Buzz was infamous for treating everyone like a servant. But it was not an abuse Kurt gladly withstood, as there was little that escaped the study. Kurt had pride developing, particularly when it came to his guitar playing, and he carried Buzz's amps. He imagined the roles reversed, and he practiced every moment he could. And the fact that he was getting better, though one of his only avenues to self-confidence, he found his hopes rewarded that Buzz and Dale asked him to jam with them in Olympia at a closing night at the Club of the Gasco. Only the 20 people that witnessed the show. The poster had billed the Brown Towel, but their name was supposed to be Brown Cow. That night could mark the debut performance in the front of a paying audience, yet rather plain guitar. Kurt read poetry while Buzz and Dale thrashed on their instruments. Many of their self-destructive habits indulged in this pink apartment were still evidence of the shack. Tracy Mandar, who met him during this period, said the amount of LSD he ingested was notable, and Kurt was doing a lot of acid, sometimes 5 times a week. She recalled. At least part of the reason was his increased drug usage was, strangely, a union loyalty at an Aberdeen grocery strike at the time. Meant you either would drive to Olympia to buy beer or cross the picket line, and Kurt's usual choice was to take acid instead. When he did buy beer, usually it was animal beer, and so-called the Schmidt cans featured wildlife images. When he had more money, Kurt would splurge for Rolling Rock because he told his friends it's almost like rock and roll, spelled backwards. The shack was the year of Kurt's longest, most extreme period of drug abuse. Previously, his patterns had been binging, then drying out. But living at the shack, he embraced being messed up like he embraced little else. He was always pushing it, remembered Steve Schillinger, using just a little bit more than anyone else and taking it as soon as he was no longer high. When he was out of money for pot and acid or beer, he'd go back to huffing aerosol cans. He was really into getting fucked up. Drugs, acid of any kind. Novoselic observed. He'd get hammered in the middle of the day. He was a mess. He also continued to talk of suicide and early death. Ryan Anger lived 1 block away from the moment he met Kurt. See, they are pushing this again. Every chapter here, he's got to have a little dedicated section to fucking suicide. Once Ryan asked Kurt what buried daily conversations about death and what are you going to do with your 30. I'm not worried about what's going to happen when I'm 30, Kurt replied in the same tone he would use to discuss a broken spark plug. Because I'm never going to make it to 30. You know what life's like after 30. I don't want that. The concept was so foreign to Ryan, who viewed the world as a young man's sense of possibility, and momentarily speechless. Ryan could not recommend the torment that was inside Kurt. He was in the shape of suicide. He looked like suicide. He walked like suicide. He talked like suicide. I don't fucking buy this shit at all. Charles L. Cross, you can lick fucking dick for saying such stupid fucking shit. By late spring, Kurt left his resort job. Desperate for money, he would occasionally work as a carpet installer alongside Ryan, and the supervisors of the carpet company like Kurt and Ryan let him know that this full-time job was possible. But Kurt balked at the prospect of the idea of the serious work that was beneath him, and an anathema that he was afraid of injuring his guitar-playing hand on the double-edged knives that he used to cut. The carpet. These hands are too important to me, Kurt argued. I could mess up my guitar-playing career, he said, looking at his hands, unable to play. It would be the end of his life. The very fact that Kurt would never be able to use the word as even used the word career to describe his music shows as the one place where the optimism existed. Those incessant hours of practicing were beginning to pay off, and he was writing songs at a prestigious rate, crudely scratching out the lyrics of the pages in his notebook. His learning was so fast and absorbing so much from the shows that what he saw and the records he listened to, you could almost see that his brain was piecing together a plan. There wasn't much focus on the band, since there was no single unit that existed at the time. Instead, caught up in his exuberance to make music, he arranged 3 or 4 groups simultaneously. One of the first going to practice at the shack featured Kurt on guitar, Chris on bass, and a local drummer named Bob McFadden. Another had Kurt playing drums, Chris on guitar, and Steve Instant Newman on bass. To call all of these groups, as Kurt did later, as a bit of an exaggeration, they were only real in Kurt's mind, and as he would put them together in a way someone might plot an ideal fantasy baseball team. Observing that the Melvins had been paid $60 a night for a gig, Kurt had formed a band called the Sellouts, which could rehearse Clearwater Revival songs. Knowing these would go over big in Aberdeen's taverns, Kurt discussed the bands as if they were lengthy careers, which most just played it for rehearsal. Only an outfit they called the Stiff Woodies would put on a public display at the kegger of high school kids who just ignored them. While the jam sessions and the parties kept Kurt occupied, the beginning of 1987, he was already developing a restlessness with the Aberdeen and his friends, and observed that he was a constant to use music as a fuel, as a way to pass a Friday night. Kurt was practicing a guitar riff on writing a song on a Saturday morning. All he lacked was a vehicle for his creativity vision. But that was about to change. He and Chris began to play with a neighborhood drummer named Aaron Buckard, and in the unnamed group, Chris played bass and Buckard drummed and Kurt played guitar and sang. It was the incubation of Nirvana and Kurt's first exploration of being a musical alpha male. They would practice almost every night, and during the few moments of 1986, Kurt thought that they had done enough for the evening, and after rehearsal they would drive to Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Kurt loved Kentucky Fried Littles from KFC, recalled Buckard. Once Kurt took electrical tape with him and made an inverted cross on a speaker of the drive-thru, and we watched from the van outside, laughing our asses off while the employees had to come outside to peel it off. In early spring, Buzz announced that he was moving to California and the Melvins were breaking up, and it was an important point in Aberdeen history that he was watching it. Kurt must have thought that he was seeing Judas in his mind, in his mist. What happened, remembered Lucan, was that I got left behind. The band was supposed to be broken up, but was just a way to get me out. Buzz said, "Oh no, I'm not even going to be in the band. I'm just moving to California." But then a month after they moved, they were playing as the Melvins again, and it was hard, since it was exactly the same way as Buzz had kicked me out from the previous drummer. The severing of his roommate from the Melvins would mark a major milestone in Kurt's own development. Everyone took sides in the spat, and Kurt, for the first time, dared challenge Buzz. Kurt moved away from the Melvins artistically, emotionally that day. Ryan remembered that Kurt had already seen his own pop-influenced music and was never going to live up to Buzz's expectations. Though he was going to continue to talk to his love for the Melvins, he had begun to outgrow Buzz as a role model, and it was a step that had to happen if it was going to develop his own voice, and through his own painful freedom creatively, and gave him his own artistic space. Kurt and Lucan had grown on each other's nerves. Kurt didn't like a few of Lucan's friends in the move, and straight out of I Love Lucy episode, he took a masking tape and ran it down the center of the house and told Lucan, his friends, that they had to stay on their side. And then when Lucan's buddies complained that he had crossed the tape to go over to the bathroom, Kurt's reply was, "Go to the bathroom out in the yard, because the bathroom's on my side." Lucan moved out, and Kurt lived in a while without a roommate, until his friend from Olympia, Dylan Carlson, moved in. With the long brown hair and a scruffy beard, Dylan looked a bit like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys during his lost years, but what came out of his mouth were outrageous views on religion, race, and politics. Dylan was a character, but he was bright, talented, and friendly, all qualities Kurt admired. They had met at a brown cow show, and a friendship was formed. Dylan moved to Aberdeen ostentatiously to work with Kurt laying the carpet. The job was something to be desired. Our boss was a total drunk, Dylan recalled. We'd show up for work in the morning and he'd be passed out on the floor in the office. One time he was passed out on the front of the door and we couldn't get it open to get in to get him up. The job fell apart, but the friendship between Dylan and Kurt would stick. With the band and a new best friend, some great songs. It was a more positive Kurt that greeted 1987 with his 20th year. And soon, surprisingly, even his sexual life would blossom with Tracy Mandar. It became his girlfriend. They bonded over rodents. Both Kurt and Tracy had pet rats. He had first met her 2 years earlier outside a punk club in Seattle, and it was the location of one of his alcohol arrests. He and Buzz were drinking in a car when Tracy came by to say hi, and Kurt was so entrapped by her, he failed to notice a police car pulling up. They ran to each other over the next year. In early 1987, they cemented a relationship, and I had been flirting with him for quite a while, Tracy said. I think he had a hard time believing a girl actually liked him. Tracy was the idyllic girlfriend for a 20-year-old Kurt, and she would signify a major marker in his path toward adulthood. And she was a year older than he was, and he had been to hundreds of punk rock shows and knew lots about music. Huge sex turn-on to Kurt. With dark hair and a curvy body and large eyes that were strikingly brown as his were blue, she was a homespun beauty with a down-earth attitude, and everything one she met, she returned in a friend. In this way, many others she could have been more different for him. He insistently was taken with her, and though at the beginning he never felt like he deserved her. Even early in the relationship, these inner wounds and the patterns of withdrawal exhibited themselves, and one of the first times went down to the bed together. They lay in the bed in the afterglow of sex, and she commented, seeing him naked, "God, you're so skinny," though she didn't know. Kurt couldn't have said anything more hurtful to him. Kurt's response was to throw on his clothes and storm outside. He came back, though, and Tracy decided that she would love him enough so his fear would disappear. She'd love him so much that he might be able to love himself, but for Kurt, this was treacherous ground, and at every corner sat an excuse for self-doubt and fear. The only thing he loved more than Tracy, was his pet rat Kitty. He had raised the male rodent from birth, and feeding him with an eyedropper the first few weeks, the rat usually stayed in his cage. But on special occasions, Kurt would let him run around the house, and since a few rats were going to spoil a filthy carpet, one day with Kurt running around the shack, Kurt found a spider on the ceiling and urged Kitty to get it. I said, "See that fucker? Kitty, get him. Kill him. Get him. Kill him." Kurt wrote in his journal, but Kitty failed to attack the spider. When Kurt returned with a can of brute deodorant spray in an attempt to kill the spider, he heard a heartbreaking noise and looked down to see my left foot on top of my rat's head. He jumped around to squealing and bleeding. I screamed, "I'm sorry," about 30 times, picked him up in a pair of dirty underwear, put him in a sack, and found a piece of 2x4 wood, took him outside and clubbed and laid it aside, and stepped all over the shack. I felt his bones and guts crush. It took about 2 minutes to put him out of his misery, and then I went into misery for the rest of the night. I obviously didn't love him enough, and as I do now. I went back into the bedroom and observed the blood stains and the spider, and I screamed "fuck you" to him and thought about killing him, and then left him there, even though to eventually crawl on my face as I lie awake all night. There's the end of chapter 6. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.